In the quiet town of Elmbrook Ridge, where dirt roads carved lazy lines through thickets of pine, and the only traffic light blinked yellow day and night, life passed like a slow hymn in an old country church. There were no skyscrapers or busy intersections here, only rustling leaves, whispering breezes, and neighbors whose lives threaded together like the pages of a well-worn diary. It was in this stillness, almost forgotten by time, that Rachel Morgan built a life with Daniel. Their love wasn't born in grand gestures or cinematic beginnings. It came softly, like the first dew on the morning grass. She had met him at a town fundraiser, back when her smile was easy and her dreams still wore their Sunday best. Daniel had charm in spades back then. He had a mind full of ambition and a tongue slick with stories of the future. A future that shimmered with possibility. Rachel, young and strong-spirited, believed in that future like a child believes in springtime after a long winter. Her trust wasn't blind, it was intentional. She didn't follow after him because she couldn't stand on her own, but because she thought love meant joining hands and walking one path. So she put her heart in his hands, and in doing so, placed her tomorrows where his promises lived. What she didn't know then was that hope, when planted too deeply in fallow ground, struggles to bloom. Rachel had grown up with simplicity braided into her bones. Her childhood home was small but never cold. Her mother, Martha, was a seamstress who stitched beauty out of scraps, and her father, Hank, a quiet man with grease-stained knuckles who fixed engines and rarely raised his voice. They had taught her that dignity wasn't found in what you owned, but in how you carried yourself. Rachel learned young that kindness cost nothing, and that strength didn't always shout. From her mother, she learned to pray before complaining. From her father, she learned to endure without bragging. So when she fell in love with Daniel Morgan, a man whose words had wings but whose plans often stalled, she wasn't blinded by fantasy. She just believed in potential, maybe a little too deeply. She took a job at Elmbrook County Nursing Home, a place where most people burned out quickly. But Rachel, she stayed. She bathed the elderly, clean-soiled sheets sat by the bedsides of the forgotten. Every paycheck she earned was folded into the dreams she and Daniel shared. An apartment in a better part of town, a small business he wanted to start, maybe even children one day. Rachel believed that if she just kept pressing forward, the light would come. After all, night didn't last forever. She told herself that while scrubbing floors at midnight and riding home on a bus full of strangers who smelled of sweat and long hours, she believed God saw her, that he was watching, that her prayers didn't bounce off the ceiling. And so she poured herself into the soil of her marriage, trusting something would grow. Daniel wasn't cruel, not at first. He wasn't lazy either, at least not in the way people think. He just always seemed to be preparing for something that never arrived. He'd spend hours poring over business articles, reading self-help books, attending workshops that cost more than they should have. He had notebooks full of ideas, delivery apps, home repair services, online coaching businesses. But execution was his stumbling block. Every venture stopped at the planning stage, as if fear sat at the door and kept him from stepping through. Rachel was patient. She encouraged him, praised his small wins, downplayed his losses. If he needed a little extra money for a course, she found it. If he needed quiet, she gave it. She never once threw her job in his face. To her, this was the give and take of partnership. And yet, in the corners of her heart, questions began to whisper. Not loud enough to echo, but soft enough to unsettle. Why didn't he try harder? Why didn't he work part-time while building his dream? Why was it always her sacrificing? She silenced those questions with prayer, with loyalty, with scripture. Two are better than one, she told herself, for if they fall, one will lift the other. Maybe she was the lifter in their season. Maybe he would lift her later. That was how love worked, or so she believed. Still, a part of her waited for the season to change, for the day Daniel would come home with news that something had finally worked, and all her years of sacrifice would be answered with fruit. That hope stayed tucked in her chest like a letter never sent. While the days crawled forward, Elmbrook Ridge spun on, and the world outside their front door didn't ask questions. Neighbors waved, unaware. Friends from church smiled the couple in the third pew, never knowing that Rachel's hands were weary and her soul wore thin. but she kept showing up at work, at home, in faith. Her co-workers admired her strength, but never guessed the weight she carried. When bills came in higher than expected, Rachel made quiet miracles happen. She cut coupons, switched brands, skipped meals. Once, when the car needed tires and they couldn't afford all 4, she bought 2 and prayed they'd hold. Her sacrifices weren't loud, but they were constant, like the ticking of a clock no one notices until it stops. And through it all, she never spoke an unkind word about Daniel. Not to her friends, not even in prayer. She would simply say, "He's working on something." And to her, that was enough. At night, she'd lay beside him, listening to the hum of the ceiling fan, wondering if she was building a home or simply holding up the roof. But she didn't voice those thoughts. Instead, she prayed, always prayed, for strength, for Daniel, for clarity, for harvest. And though the harvest hadn't come, she kept sowing because Rachel Morgan was a woman of her word, and she had vowed, not just to Daniel but to God, and vows to her were not just paper and ink, they were sacred ground. The day Rachel lost her job began like any other, quiet, humid, and unassuming. The sun had barely risen when she stepped off the porch, clutching her lunch bag and thermos, her mind busy with thoughts of patient rounds and medication logs. The bus came late that morning, and something in her spirit felt off, like a violin string pulled too tight. The sky hung lower than usual, and even the birds seemed subdued. When she arrived at Elmbrook County Nursing Home, the front desk staff wouldn't meet her eyes. There was a folded letter waiting for her on the supervisor's desk, sealed and sterile like a hospital sheet. The words were stiff and bureaucratic, something about budget cuts and restructuring. It didn't matter how many years she had served, or how many lives she had touched. Her name had been on a list. Her chair had already been emptied. Her replacement was already being trained. Rachel stood there, letter trembling in her hands, listening as her supervisor mumbled hollow apologies. It was not the loss of the paycheck that hit first. It was the stripping of purpose. This was not just her job. It was the way she had fed her marriage, clothed her dignity, and proven to herself every day that she was doing something that mattered. She left the building with her head high, but her chest hollow. The afternoon heat pressed down on her shoulders as she waited for the return bus, surrounded by strangers who couldn't see the storm that had just broken open inside her. When she walked into the house that day, Daniel didn't look up from the couch. He was scrolling on his phone, headphones in his ears, eyes glued to a screen filled with someone else's life. She stood in the doorway longer than necessary, expecting him to ask what she was doing home so early, or at least why she looked like her whole world had just unraveled, but the question never came. Rachel placed her things on the table and sat down slowly, hoping he would notice something was wrong without her needing to say it. Still, silence hung between them like a stubborn curtain. When she finally spoke and told him the news, there was a pause, so brief it almost felt imagined, and then he muttered something that sounded like, and went back to his screen. No embrace, no reassurance, no, we'll figure it out. Just indifference, as if she had said she forgot to buy eggs. Her chest tightened, but she said nothing more. That night, there was no special dinner, no prayer between them, no moment of unity. Daniel went to bed early, leaving Rachel in the kitchen alone, staring at the unpaid bills fanned across the table like a deck of warnings. She whispered a short prayer through tired lips, not even knowing what to ask for. There was a heaviness creeping in now, slow and unwelcome, a realization that something sacred between them had shifted, and she wasn't sure if it could be repaired. Days turned into weeks, and what little warmth that had lingered in their home began to dissolve like sugar in hot tea. Without a job to report to, Rachel's days became a cycle of sweeping, cooking, washing, and waiting, and Daniel, instead of stepping up or seeking employment himself, seemed to nest deeper into apathy. He began to leave dishes in the sink without thought, demanded meals at odd hours, and treated her silence as consent. It wasn't long before he stopped helping with even the smallest things. When she asked if he could take out the trash, he said, "Aren't you home all day now?" And it wasn't just the chores. The way he spoke to her changed too. His words, once dipped in charm, now came sharp and shallow, like pebbles thrown against glass. He complained about the meals being cold, the clothes not folded the way he liked, the house not clean enough, as though she were a hired hand and not his wife. Rachel bore it quietly, biting her tongue till it bled. Not out of weakness, but because she still believed the man she had married was buried somewhere beneath the bitterness. She kept telling herself it was just a season, that the sting of losing her job had shaken them both in ways neither knew how to admit. But deep down, another voice, one she didn't recognize, began to whisper questions she couldn't silence. When had respect left their home? When did she stop being his partner and start being his servant? Her heart ached, not from the work, but from the erasure. It was a Thursday morning when Rachel first noticed the change in his routine. Daniel began dressing differently, cleaner shirts, cologne she didn't recognize, and an odd sense of urgency in the way he left the house. He used to linger in his pajamas till noon, but now he was up before her. His phone never left his hand, and when she asked where he was going, the answers came clipped and vague. Out, or meeting someone about a gig. At first, she wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that maybe he had finally decided to pull his weight, to try to remember what partnership meant. But then the rumors started, subtle at first. A friend from church mentioned seeing him at a cafe in the next town, laughing with a woman who wasn't Rachel. A cousin said they thought they saw him coming out of a beauty salon, his arm around someone unfamiliar. Rachel didn't want to believe it, but the signs became harder to ignore. One night she found a small strand of blonde hair on his jacket. Another day a lipstick stain the color of betrayal bloomed on his collar. She didn't confront him, not yet. Instead, she sat in the bathroom with the door locked, held her Bible to her chest, and cried so quietly the walls didn't even echo. She opened to the Psalms, not looking for any passage in particular, just hoping the pages would comfort her the way arms no longer did. I am forgotten as a dead man out of mind. I am like a broken vessel, she read aloud, voice cracking. And that night, as Daniel returned home smelling of perfume that didn't belong to her, Rachel didn't weep. She just stood at the sink, hands deep in dishwater, and prayed in silence. Not for him, but for herself. There was something unnatural about the way Daniel started humming again. For weeks he had hardly spoken more than a few words to Rachel, and now, almost overnight, he began whistling low tunes as he slipped out the door in the mornings. He started to shave more frequently, ironed his shirts with care, shirts Rachel hadn't seen him touch in months. One morning she noticed a pair of polished loafers by the door, shoes that hadn't seen daylight since a cousin's wedding 2 years ago. She watched him from the kitchen as he adjusted the collar of his pale blue shirt, sprayed a cologne she didn't recognize, and tapped something eagerly into his phone. He didn't say goodbye before leaving. He hadn't said goodbye in weeks. Rachel stood there with a rag in her hand and an ache in her stomach that no food could cure. Something was wrong, and her heart knew it before her mind caught up. There were always signs when love began to rot, from the inside, not always visible, but felt. His laughter came too easily now, too often, but never within the walls of their home. She once asked him if he'd like breakfast, and he said, "Already ate," then turned away before she could ask where. Rachel stopped asking after that. At first she tried to silence the suspicion. She blamed herself, the job loss, the silence that had grown between them. She wondered if maybe she hadn't encouraged him enough, if perhaps her prayers had grown too routine, too desperate. But it wasn't just instinct that betrayed him. It was evidence, subtle, deliberate, undeniable. Receipts tucked into his wallet from restaurants she'd never been to. A woman's bracelet she found wedged beneath the passenger seat of their car. One afternoon, while folding laundry, she reached for his jacket and something hard fell out, a key ring with a tiny heart-shaped charm dangling from it. Her hands froze. She stared at it for a long time, the world narrowing to that small piece of metal that said more than words ever could. She didn't cry, not immediately. Not in the way heartbreaks are portrayed in novels. Instead, she just stood there, still, her breath coming slower than usual, her mind trying to convince her it was all a mistake, that maybe it belonged to someone else, that maybe it was nothing. But even hope has its limits, and Rachel could no longer hold hers in both hands. She placed the charm back where she found it and walked into the next room like nothing had happened. Because sometimes denial is not weakness, it's just a temporary shelter until the storm in the heart calms enough to think clearly. When confirmation finally came, it didn't arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It came through the mouth of someone who didn't know they were holding a blade. Her old co-worker, Marcia, had invited her out for coffee, one of those rare visits that Rachel used to enjoy before life became too complicated. They sat across from each other in a small booth near the courthouse square, sipping tea, when Marcia leaned forward with casual concern. "Hey, I didn't want to be messy, but I saw Daniel last week over at Galloway's diner with some woman. Didn't think much of it until I realized she wasn't you." Rachel didn't flinch, she didn't gasp. She just smiled politely and took another sip of tea, her hands steady while her soul trembled. She had short blonde hair, pretty, looked younger. They seemed close. Marcia had no idea she had poured gasoline on a fire that had already been burning for weeks. Rachel thanked her for the company, made an excuse to leave early, and walked all the way home. The sky was overcast that day, the kind of gray that sat heavy on the skin. She passed familiar houses and shops, faces she'd known for years, and yet she felt invisible, not because no one saw her, but because she no longer recognized the woman inside her own skin. She reached her front porch and stood there for a while, as if crossing that threshold meant surrendering to the new truth. When she finally stepped inside, the house felt different, not colder, not emptier, but foreign, like it belonged to a version of her that no longer existed. Rachel didn't confront Daniel. She didn't scream or demand explanations. She didn't pull out the receipts or wave the charm in his face. Instead, she turned inward. She moved slower around the house, not because of fatigue, but because her spirit was navigating new terrain. She cleaned less, not out of rebellion, but because something inside her had shifted. She still prepared meals, but not with the same warmth. She still folded his clothes, but the motions were mechanical. It was prayer, not confrontation, that became her anchor. Every morning before dawn, she knelt at the foot of the bed, her hands clasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lord, I don't know what to do with this pain," she would murmur, "but I trust you still see me." She read scriptures in the stillness, not as a routine, but as a lifeline. Psalm 34 verse 18 became her breath. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." She found herself drawn to the Psalms, to stories of weeping that turned into dancing, to verses that reminded her God was not absent in betrayal. She didn't pray for Daniel to return. She didn't ask for revenge. She prayed for strength, not the loud kind, but the quiet, enduring kind that grows in the soil of sorrow. Each night, as Daniel returned home smelling of perfume that wasn't hers, she would be sitting quietly with her Bible on her lap. She looked at him not with hatred, but with a strange peace, one born from the knowledge that God sees all things, even when others do not. And in that truth she began to rise, slowly, softly, but surely. The mornings began to feel different for Rachel, not because the sun rose any brighter or the birds sang any louder, but because something inside her had shifted. It was as if grief, having lingered long enough, began to hollow out a space for clarity. She still woke early, often before the first light touched the curtains, but now it wasn't to start chores or to prepare breakfast for a man who barely acknowledged her. She rose to pray not as a routine but as a quiet form of rebuilding. Her knees met the cold floor beside her bed, and her words rose not with desperation but with trust. There was no longer a list of requests. Her prayers had changed tone. She wasn't asking God to change Daniel anymore. She was asking him to shape her, to give her strength to live without bitterness, to fill the places Daniel's betrayal had emptied. She whispered scriptures as if they were the very air in her lungs, clutching them like rope in a storm. Isaiah 26 verse 3 became her anchor. "You will keep in perfect peace those whose minds are steadfast, because they trust in you." And she clung to that peace. It didn't mean the pain vanished, but the ache was no longer a weapon against her. It became a tool, carving out something new inside her spirit. She moved through the house with a grace she didn't explain. She didn't sulk. She didn't retaliate. She simply lived as if she were reclaiming herself, inch by inch. Daniel noticed the difference, but not in a way he could articulate. He began to glance at her longer when he thought she wasn't looking. There was less command in his tone now, less entitlement. The meals still appeared on the table, but the warmth that used to wrap around each dish was gone. Rachel no longer hovered, asking how his day was. She didn't wait by the door anymore. She didn't fill the silences with soft laughter or gentle nudges. Her presence had become quiet, yet it carried weight. There were no angry words between them, just a widening gap that neither dared address. And yet, there was something unsettling about her calm. Daniel could sense it. A part of him expected her to break, to scream, to accuse him openly, but instead she simply grew quieter and more radiant. The woman who once wrapped herself around his every need was now walking with a strength that didn't depend on his attention. One evening, as she sat by the window reading, her face lit by the golden hour sun, Daniel found himself watching her with unease. She looked like someone who had already said goodbye in her heart, and maybe she had. But Rachel wasn't planning an escape or plotting revenge. She was building herself back with prayer, solitude, and scripture. She wasn't in a hurry to prove anything. She had found something Daniel couldn't take from her, her dignity, her voice, and the quiet power that comes when a woman stops begging to be seen. It was a strange shift, being in the same house, breathing the same air, yet living in completely different worlds. Daniel came and went, but Rachel had stopped keeping track. The details of his whereabouts no longer mattered. There was a time she'd lie awake wondering if he was with Monica, picturing their conversations, their laughter, the ease with which he gave another woman what he had withheld from her. But those images no longer tormented her. They felt distant now, like dreams she had already mourned. She had given them to God, and though the wound still ached, it no longer controlled her. Rachel filled her days with quiet tasks, gardening, journaling, sometimes sitting for hours on the back porch watching the trees sway in the wind. And in those moments, she began to hear herself again, not the version of her shaped by marriage or burdened by duty, but the voice that existed before betrayal dulled her light. She began to hum old hymns while cleaning, not for show, but because they steadied her hands. The neighbors sometimes saw her and waved. She waved back, not with the same cheer as before, but with a dignity that didn't require explanation. Her house was still in order, but her soul was no longer tied to the outcomes she couldn't control. It was this inner stillness, this peace, that made Daniel restless. He returned home one evening and asked, "You all right?" She turned to him, held his gaze, and said with a voice neither cold nor warm, "I've never been clearer." It wasn't a challenge, it was a fact. There was one night, quiet, moonless, and heavy with the scent of rain, that Daniel sat at the foot of the bed long after Rachel had gone to sleep. The television was off, his phone was silent, and for the first time in weeks, the noise around him had finally settled. He looked at her, really looked at her, as she slept with a Bible resting on the nightstand beside her. She looked peaceful, untouchable, and something about that terrified him. He remembered the Rachel who had once fought to stay close to him, the woman who used to light up at his presence, who held his head when he was discouraged. That woman was gone now, not physically, but spiritually. She had changed shape without needing to announce it, and Daniel, for all his faults, could feel that absence. It gnawed at him, not because he loved her well, but because he was beginning to understand just how much he had lost while he was chasing shadows. He ran a hand over his face and sat in the stillness, unsure of what to say or do. But in that quiet moment, for the first time, shame whispered into the cracks of his pride. Not guilt for getting caught, real shame, the kind that showed him a mirror, and in that reflection he didn't see a man in control. He saw a man who had taken gold and treated it like gravel, and the terrifying thing was, Rachel hadn't raised her voice once. She had simply become someone he no longer recognized, someone whole. There came a day when Rachel stood in front of the mirror, watching her reflection with a kind of solemn curiosity. She wasn't looking for flaws, not this time. Instead, she was searching for something deeper, something that had been buried beneath the weight of disappointment, anger, and loneliness. The woman she saw in the mirror was different from the one she had been just a few months ago. Her eyes weren't just tired, they were clear. Her skin, while worn from the struggle, glowed with a quiet strength she hadn't noticed before. She had learned to love herself again, not because she had conquered the storm, but because she had stopped running from it. Daniel had been the anchor she thought she needed, but now she realized she was her own foundation. The voice in her head had changed, no longer the voice of a woman pleading for recognition, but of one who was whole, even in the absence of everything she once thought she needed. She turned from the mirror and walked to the kitchen, the sound of her steps echoing in the empty house. Daniel had left hours ago, as usual, leaving her alone with her thoughts. But this solitude no longer felt like an empty space to fill. It felt like freedom. She began to clean, not out of duty, but because the rhythm of her movements soothed her mind. Each dish, each sweeping motion, was a quiet reaffirmation of the life she was building. She didn't need him to see her, to validate her. She had become the woman she was meant to be all along, a woman who had survived, who had endured. And in that endurance, she had discovered her power. Daniel had been gone for most of the day, and when he finally returned, it was late, later than usual. He stumbled through the door, smelling of whiskey and something Rachel couldn't quite place. He looked tired, his face drawn and shadowed. But there was something else there too, an odd tension, as if he knew he was walking into a place where the rules had changed, and he wasn't sure how to navigate it. Rachel was sitting in the living room, not waiting for him, but simply existing in the quiet, her thoughts calm but firm. She didn't greet him with her usual warmth, nor did she turn to him with anger. She simply looked at him, eyes soft but unwavering. Daniel hesitated by the door, his hand lingering on the frame. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. What was there left to say? What could he possibly offer her now, after everything he had done, everything he had left unsaid? She had changed, and he couldn't figure out how to keep up. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice neither sweet nor cold, just neutral, a mirror of the calm that had settled within her. Daniel stared at her, unsure of how to respond. His mind raced, searching for the right words, the ones that would somehow make everything right again, but he came up empty. Rachel waited, unhurried, watching him struggle with the silence. She knew what he was doing, looking for a crack in her armor, a sign that she was still the same woman who had bended her will to his, but that woman no longer existed. "You don't have to explain yourself," she said finally, breaking the stillness. "I already know." The words hit him like a punch. He didn't know how to respond, didn't know if he even had a right to. But Rachel wasn't offering him forgiveness. She wasn't offering anything but her own truth, and Daniel realized in that moment just how much he had lost, not just her love, but the respect he had taken for granted. Her forgiveness wasn't something he could claim or demand. It was something she had given herself, and that, more than anything, made him feel small. The next few weeks passed like fog over a still lake, uncertain, heavy, but not without clarity. Daniel began to retreat further into himself, sensing that Rachel was no longer waiting for him to return to her, but was, instead, walking a path he couldn't follow. His attempts to rekindle their connection felt hollow, like words spoken to an echo. He would sit beside her on the couch, trying to make conversation, but Rachel's responses were brief, not because she was cold, but because she no longer needed to fill the air with pleasantries. He began to notice the small things, the way she had rearranged the living room, the new plants she'd started growing in the kitchen, the way her eyes no longer darted nervously when he entered a room. She was becoming someone new, someone that didn't need him to complete her. She didn't need his approval, and Daniel, for the first time, began to feel the full weight of his choices. His anger and resentment had been misdirected. He had blamed her for their distance, but now, in the silence between them, he understood. The distance had been created long before Rachel had started looking inward. It had been his own unwillingness to see her, his own disregard for the woman who had given everything to him. And now she was reclaiming herself, taking back the pieces of her soul he had discarded without thought. One evening, as Rachel was finishing her meal, Daniel stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching her. For the first time he realized that her beauty wasn't just in her smile or her presence. It was in her resilience. It was in the way she held herself in the absence of his love. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to say something, anything that could reverse the damage he had done, but the words felt inadequate. He couldn't fix this, and Rachel wasn't waiting for him to. The woman before him was strong, whole, and self-sufficient. She didn't need him anymore, and that truth cut deeper than any apology ever could. The day Daniel left was neither dramatic nor final. It wasn't marked by harsh words or slammed doors. It happened with the quiet realization that he had nothing left to give, and no right to ask for anything in return. Rachel had already made her decision. It had been building in the quiet spaces between them, in the moments she had spent discovering herself, in the days of prayer, reflection, and self-realization. She had already let go, not out of anger, but out of necessity. Love for her had become something she had to offer herself first before giving it to anyone else. And Daniel had already taken more than his share. The last conversation they had was not filled with accusations, but with the understanding that they had both lost something. He had lost her, and she had lost the man she had once believed in. When he stood by the door, suitcase in hand, Rachel didn't offer him a plea. She didn't beg him to stay. She simply told him, "You don't have to leave, but you can't stay here anymore." It wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. It was the truth spoken without anger or bitterness, but with the weight of everything she had endured. Daniel nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes, and left. The door clicked softly behind him, and Rachel exhaled a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. It was over, but it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something new, something she had already started on her own, without him, without anyone. Rachel Morgan had become her own answer, and that was all she needed. The days after Daniel's departure felt strangely calm, not empty, not chaotic, just still like the earth after a long storm. Rachel didn't celebrate. She didn't throw away his belongings or dance through the rooms. She simply moved forward, quietly, softly. There was no need for declarations. What she had faced had already spoken volumes. She cleaned the house not to erase him but to reclaim it. One room at a time, she restored her space to reflect the woman she had become. The kitchen no longer held the ghost of burnt dinners served to silence. The living room, once a cold witness to evenings of indifference, now welcomed light again. She rearranged the furniture, not to forget the past, but to give the present a new rhythm. Her mornings were sacred now, early tea, a walk through the garden, and long moments with her Bible, no longer reading with a heavy heart, but with eyes that searched for wisdom. There was healing in that stillness. She wasn't rushing to feel better. She let her heart mend in its own time. Her prayers shifted from survival to gratitude, not for what she had endured, but for the fact that she had come through it with her faith intact. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was chasing peace. It had found her, moved into her home, and rested quietly in the corners where resentment used to hide. One afternoon, Rachel stood beneath the oak tree at the back of the yard, her fingers brushing the rough bark as memories of past summers played like soft music in her mind. There had been a time when she imagined a family here, children playing beneath that tree, laughter echoing across the fence line. It had been a sweet hope, but it no longer stung the way it once did. She didn't see it as a failure, only a path she didn't walk. And there was no bitterness in that. Life, she had learned, wasn't always about getting what you expected. It was about finding meaning in what remained. She walked the perimeter of her small garden, where tomatoes were just beginning to ripen, and breathed in the scent of mint and rosemary. Her hands, once worn from overwork, now served only what she chose to tend. A neighbor called out from the fence, an older woman named Claire, who had lived down the street for years. They hadn't spoken much in the past, but today Claire waved a jar of honey and said, "You always look so peaceful lately. Whatever you're doing, keep at it." Rachel smiled, not with pride but with quiet acceptance. She was not healed in the way some might expect. The past was still a part of her, but it no longer defined her. It lived behind her, like a chapter she had closed without tearing the page. And it was that kind of peace, unspoken, earned, unshakable, that now radiated from her without effort. Word eventually spread that Daniel had moved to another town. Rumors floated in from old acquaintances and distant cousins, but Rachel didn't ask questions. She wasn't curious. There was nothing left to reopen. Forgiveness, she had learned, wasn't an event, it was a process, one she had walked through quietly, step by aching step. She didn't hate Daniel. She didn't wish him harm. She simply released him into the hands of time. People came to her more now, not just for her cooking or her gentle advice, but for her strength. Women who had once watched her from a distance began to seek her out, not with pity, but with reverence. They wanted to know how she held herself together, how she prayed through betrayal, how she smiled without pretending. And Rachel never told them it was easy. She told them it was necessary, that the pain didn't kill her, it cleaned her, that God didn't take her out of the fire, He stayed with her in it. One evening, a young woman knocked on her door, tears in her eyes, hands trembling as she asked, "Did you ever think you'd make it out?" Rachel didn't answer right away. She took the girl's hands, led her to the porch, and said, "I didn't make it out. I walked through it, and each step I took, God lit the next one." There was no sermon in her voice, only truth. And that truth comforted more than any long speech ever could. As the seasons shifted, so did Rachel's soul. Autumn settled gently over Elmbrook Ridge, painting the trees in fire and rust. The breeze carried the scent of change, and Rachel welcomed it with open windows and open hands. She didn't know what the next chapter would bring. She no longer needed certainty to feel safe. Every prayer she whispered now was lighter, more honest, not desperate, but full of expectancy. One morning, as she sat on the porch sipping from a chipped mug, a verse came to her, not because she was searching, but because it arrived like a familiar friend. Those who sow in tears will reap with songs of joy. She had sown deeply. Every sleepless night, every silent meal, every tear on her pillow had been a seed. And now, without even realizing, she was beginning to harvest joy, not in loud celebrations, but in stillness, in smiles, in peace that wrapped around her like a warm shawl. The sun rose slowly that morning, and Rachel leaned back in her chair, letting it rest on her face. She had no regrets, no bitterness, only gratitude for a God who had stayed with her in the silence, who had held her hand when no one else did, and that was enough, more than enough. The story hadn't ended in sorrow. It had bloomed, slowly, silently, into something beautiful, something whole. To everyone who's just listened to this story, you may not be Rachel, but maybe you've carried her kind of pain. Maybe you've loved someone who forgot your worth, stood by people who didn't stand by you, or prayed through silent tears when the world around you couldn't hear your breaking heart. This story isn't just about betrayal, it's about becoming whole again, about how God can rebuild what others try to destroy, and how you can find your voice again, even when you've been silenced for too long. Let me tell you this, you are not invisible, and you are not foolish for loving deeply. Love isn't weakness, and prayer isn't wasted breath. You may have been used, underestimated, or taken for granted, but God has seen it all. Every tear, every sleepless night, every time you bit your tongue just to keep the peace, He saw you. And just like Rachel, you're not broken, you're becoming wiser, stronger, clearer. Don't let betrayal be your ending. Let it be the beginning of your rising. You don't need revenge. What you need is restoration, and the God who restores is still on His throne. So right now, wherever you are, whether you're driving, sitting in your room, or lying awake in the middle of the night, join me in this prayer. Heavenly Father, thank You for being the God who sees in secret. Thank You for walking with us through the valleys, especially the ones paved with tears, silence, and heartbreak. Tonight, we lift up every listener who has been carrying the weight of betrayal, rejection, and emotional abandonment. Lord, remind them that their value isn't tied to who left or who didn't see them. It's tied to You. Wrap them in Your peace. Let Your love wash over the wounds no one else can see. Heal what man broke, repair what life damaged. For every woman and man listening who has poured themselves into others and been left empty, fill them again. For those who have given their best and were repaid with silence, restore their joy, restore their laughter, restore their strength. We come against every lie that says, "You're not enough." We rebuke every spirit of shame, bitterness, and defeat. We declare freedom over their minds, freedom over their homes, freedom over their hearts. Let a new beginning rise from their ashes. Father, we speak Psalm 126 verse 5 over them. They that sow in tears shall reap in joy. Turn their mourning into dancing. Let them wake up with peace that doesn't make sense, and strength they didn't even know they had. And for every person listening who still has to live beside someone who doesn't value them, give them grace, wisdom, and power to walk in dignity. Lift their head, Lord. Let them know you are the one who makes all things new. We thank you because even when people turn away, you never leave. When doors close, you open better ones. And when the world forgets us, you call us by name. Let this be their season of clarity, their season of rising, their season of walking into rooms and no longer shrinking. We declare it done in the mighty name of Jesus. Amen. If this prayer touched your spirit, if you're claiming healing, strength, or a fresh start today, then don't scroll past. Type Amen in the comments. Let the world know you're rising. Let heaven see your faith. And let someone else reading your comment be encouraged to hold on just a little longer. You're not alone, you're not forgotten, and you're not finished yet. More grace to you.